So and with that, I'd like to welcome Dr. Barry Kramer.
Great, well, thank you very much for inviting me, and I know that a lot of you are extremely sophisticated in your use of computers, and I'm hoping to get some input, basically, about that side of my project, because I come at this from a neurobiological perspective, but what I'm trying to do is understand how we can make some biomimetic robots that currently don't exist. And to do that, we're going to need some methods to control these things. And we're going to need to talk about things like genetic algorithms, about optimization techniques, strategies for understanding how to make something work when we don't necessarily know and can't define all the details of what's inside the robot, or in this case the animal. So I'm going to actually talk quite a bit of biology, but I'm really willing to answer questions on the way as things come up. That way it'll help me know if what I'm saying is making sense or if it's interesting. I actually have some animals here which I'll show you, but maybe we'll wait till after the meal's gone before we hand those around. So, I've got a few aids here which to try and illustrate some of what I'm talking about. I don't want us to spend a huge amount of time just watching slides, but what I'm going to try and do is talk about how if you compare most robots to living things, you can clearly tell the difference just from the materials that they're made of. Now, the majority of machines that are built as robots don't need to be biomimetic. Okay, that's the first thing, and I understand that, so any of you that are offended by talking about biomimetic robots, please don't. Biomimetic robots is one small class of robots. It's not necessarily the only one. But if we want to try and make machines that can replicate the versatility of animals, then we have to think about materials that we use being generated to presumably produce that behavior. And that's just an example. What you see here is these two muscles on the back of the animal and in the belly. And this is the length change of those muscles during a crawl. This is the electrical activity of the two muscles, color-coded. So we can pick up both parts. So, given that, one of the questions is, if you stimulate the muscle just as if the animal's walking around, while you're moving the muscle as if it's walking around, how does it behave? And so we take the muscle out, and that's shown here, and this is the nervous system that controls it in that body segment. So we can take them out, we can stick this on the machine, we can stimulate the nerve to the muscle, and we can stimulate it at a very specific time in its cycle.
So that's a live muscle and a live neuron pulled from the animal.
Yep. So this is actually the whole ganglion. That's got 700. That's the one with 700 nerve cells. This is one of the muscles. Muscles are much bigger, of course. This is the time at which we stimulate in this example. Here is the length of the muscle. We've simplified its so instead of a complicated movement, we've simplified the normal crawl movement with this ramp. And here is the force that's developed. And
is this in vitro?
This is yes. We take the muscle out of the animal and keep it alive. Yeah. And we can take the brain out and keep it alive. That's the other big one. So this is what you saw before, that work loop. And look what we've got now. We're stimulating at a very specific time in this window here, just as the animal appears to do. And what we get now is the work loop is a figure of 8. Here it's dissipating work, acting like a brake or a shock absorber. Here it's actively acting as a motor. So within one step of one cycle of this muscle, it switches its function from being a motor to being a brake. So we can ask all sorts of questions now. What happens if we change the timing there? So we can advance the spark of the engine, and look what happens. It becomes a dissipative loop. Just advance it through and you get these different work loops formed all the way through. So what I'm saying here is that all the animal has to know in order to get these very, very different sorts of response from the muscle is when to stimulate. Doesn't have to do anything else. Just stimulate at a different time or a different duration.
With respect to what?
With respect to the length change of the muscle as it cycles. Where it is in its crawl, yes.
It sounds very similar to actions in a neural network, such as in the brain, because they found in neuroscience that when you, for example, when I want to do something like walk, what my brain is doing is it's sending signals step, step, step to a subsidiary neural circuit, which is going, okay, make this muscle do this muscle do this muscle do this. It sounds in this case, that the computation is offloaded to the actual muscle tissue, in a sense, by its
That's what I'm proposing. Absolutely.
Into its structure.
Yep. And so, I mean, one of the big surprises to us, and it probably shouldn't have been, but if you look in the literature, you can find this anyway. We knew that muscles only contract when you stimulate them. Okay. Then when you stop stimulating them, they stay where they are until they're re-extended. So that's why you have a flexor and an extensor, right? So you do this. Now, if we didn't have an extensor, I'm stuck there, whether or not I'm stimulating the muscle, because you can't actively make it expand again. You have to stretch it out. So when we recorded from the muscles in this animal, we were very surprised because during a stimulus to the muscle, we found the muscles in many cases are getting longer. The muscles
so the muscle has this gooey kind of sort of amorphous kind of behavior.
It's not that, it hasn't specialized yet.
No, it's
one-way system, two-way system.
No, it isn't actually. You'd think it would be. It actually works exactly the same as our muscles, it turns out.
But it works in concert with other forces.
All the others, yes. So it's being stretched by everybody else. And so the question is, why is it being stimulated if it's getting longer? And the answer clearly is it's being told to stiffen up and transmit forces around instead of actually being visible and motor. So, belabor the point here, but what I'm saying is that this tissue, this muscle, and we think other tissues in the animal too, is a very smart material. It has a complexity in it that is sensitive to the forces, the lengths, the history, the rate at which it's being moved, the timing at which it's being stimulated, all affect and create this incredibly complicated set of responses that my colleague is hoping to model mathematically. My postdoc, we get work loops that we'd never believe. I mean, they just do these figure of 8 work loops because of the complexity of the tissue.
Nice ears.
It's great, isn't it? Okay.
So are you saying that the hypothesis that there's a trade-off between complexity of the material and simplicity of the control link?
That's my hypothesis, and it's counterintuitive.
Okay.
If you know, most of us would say that if you make a more complicated mechanical system, you'll need to have a more complex controller. What I would argue is that evolution, and not me, I get this from a lot of people, evolution has selected the net output, not the neural control or the mechanics. So there's a fixed total amount of computation, if you will. If you do more of it in the periphery, you need less in the central nervous system. So it's a testable hypothesis. So how do we test that? Well, there are lots of ways, but one is to try and, as I think Richard Feynman said, you know, I don't understand anything I can't build. Is to try and build a system that works this way. And our approach is manifold. We're going to make a virtual caterpillar, and I think all of you here could help us in this in some way. We've collected lots of data about neural control, sensory feedback, and that type of thing. We've got lots of information on the forces and the kinematics, the motion. We know the structures. We've got these things scanned, the 3D scanners, and we know the internal layout of the muscles. We also know the muscle properties and the tissue properties by doing quite sophisticated testing. So if we put all that together, we should be able to build a simulation, a virtual caterpillar, that will behave in a similar way to the caterpillar. We will use finite element approaches. We've got to then make this thing move and test our hypotheses about whether it will move appropriately. And this is an area that I know a lot of people here are experts in. I don't know a lot about this area. I got interested in it a few years ago when an undergraduate who was studying artificial intelligence came to my lab and started to introduce these ideas. And I said, yeah, that's a great way to go. Not necessarily just genetic algorithms, but some optimization technique in which we don't need to stipulate and define all the different parameters of motion. What we do is we create a set of commands that might make sense, that we think are reasonable, and we mutate them, and we run until we can get a system that kind of works, and then look to see how it's working. So, need a lot of input on that. It's obviously a very crude stage right now.
As you're doing all that in silicon? You're doing all that in silicon?
Yeah. The as everybody says, that's all well and good. You can learn a lot that way, but your simulation always works because you make it work. So it's a good idea to check that you're really grounded in reality and try and make these things work in the physical world where you can't necessarily control the physics. And so we're also trying to build robots. That becomes an interesting topic in itself, aside from what we can learn about biology.
So I have like a shrink wrap software. Manufacture software, and then you put the box in plastic, heat it up, and create a membrane, and you shrink it with a heat gun. So why can't we take some of that carbon material that your friend had, put a little bit of it and shrink it, shrink wrap it in some stretchable cellophane, stick an electrode in it, right, and then use an off-board computer to simulate the neural control, and then just sort of glue a pile of these things together and see if we can
Sure.
control.
I love it. It's a great idea. Right now, DARPA has a request for proposals, actually last week. The ChemBot thing, have you seen this? They're interested in producing, they call it soft-bodied robots, but they want a chemistry initiative in which there are state transitions in materials that allow them to get motion and to be able to control it. I don't think they know what they want exactly. I think they're shaking the trees to see what falls. But they have got things like gel solid transition materials that they'd like to be in that. I think we're a long, long way from being able to do that, and I don't see many people talking in terms of not just building smart materials, but also building the control system as an integral part of the smart material. They have to be built together. The traditional robotic approach is to build your robot and then add on a control system, or to build a control system that works with, with the robot that's there. What I'm arguing is that the materials are absolutely intrinsic to the control. You have to have them both at the same time.
I might be jumping ahead, but when you talk about this soft-bodied robot, what's the basic actuator? It's not a spinning motor.
Yeah,
some sort of
right. So the thing about biomimetics, and my colleagues in biology have warned me that once you start going down the engineering route, you're in trouble, because the engineers will start to solve the problems they want to solve, not the ones you want to solve. The basic issue is, what do you do to make a motor? If you pick a rotary motor, you're no longer biomimetic. All of this stuff that I just talked about is gone because you no longer can control it in the same way. Use a PD controller and you're away. What we have to do is find artificial muscles. And any of you that have done robotics probably know that there isn't such a thing yet as such. There are polymers, but there's nothing that's particularly good. What we've done is take
memory metal too, right?
Yeah, that's what we're doing. So what we've done is take a composite approach. We use a shape memory alloy, which is shown up here, which is fantastic for developing force, but they don't contract very much length. So to mimic the muscle, we wind it into springs. Just trade off the enormous force potential to get a lot more strain, a lot more length change. And then we bond it at each end into a silicone elastomer in this case. Right now it's a simple elastomer. We will have composite elastomers that are complex in the next stage. This is called dragon skin, and I have some to show you if you're interested. And so what we have is an actuator now that is, to all intents and purposes, soft. I mean, yes, it is a metal, but it's crumpled on the scale we're talking about.
All right, what's dragon skin?
Dragon skin is a silicone elastomer. It's a commercial name for a 2-part platinum cured elastomer. The nice thing is you can cure it to any sort of consistency you want within reason. It can be soft and tacky, like almost like human skin, or softer, or you can make it quite stiff.
So you took something that naturally expands under stimulation, coils it, and then makes it naturally contract?
The coil naturally contracts. So this shape memory alloy is a state transition material that goes between two crystalline states, one of which is more compact than the other. So when it's heated, it becomes more compact. And the heat is provided by electric current. So it will shorten, and then it will stay there unless it's stretched again, just like a regular muscle.
Okay. So that part is like a muscle.
Yes. Yes,
And
it
you
is.
coil it and you amplify the effect.
Yep.
So that the total contraction is a much larger
That's
percent.
correct. And we should be able to build in some of the other properties too with the elastomer, because the two are composite in series. We're actually thinking about making woven SMA composites that are woven textiles with this material too. So the basic outline is something like this. This is real crude, I apologize, but it's the conceptual idea of how we might do this. Mimic abstract the way the animals are arranged and then add muscles. We can, of course, create a complete perfect model of the caterpillar, because we can get a 3D scan and scale it up, do rapid prototyping, make a mold, pour the mold, and make a big rubber caterpillar. And in fact, that's one of the things we want to do, because the shape, not just the material properties, are key to what motion you get. You know this. If you put a fold in something and then press on it, where it's going to bend is at the fold, or not, depending on the direction. So the actual fine detail of the body, and as you were holding those animals, you might have seen them extremely complex. They've got a lot of folds in them, and so that's going to be important at some point. So we actually have then got to think about the controllers. How are we doing on time?
Still doing okay.
The current model that we're using is one that's found throughout biology, that there is a central pattern generator, as you were talking about. There are sets of neurons that generate oscillations that put out those oscillations as motor patterns to the muscle. So here is the actual data from the animal. And we're replicating that, or mimicking it, with a frequency modulated series of pulses to the shape memory alloy to get the shortening of the shape memory alloy. What, of course, we'll need to do is have some complexity to the patterns and start to optimize the complexity. And we'll probably, instead of using neural networks, initially we'll use Alke's limit cycle oscillators, which were very successful. They mimic the way most biological systems work very well. And basic outline, what we want to do is have very simple control. We have a master oscillator which just tells it how fast it's walking. So is it walking 1 step a minute or 1 step a second? Each of those pulses, if you will, is coupled to an oscillator that generates the frequencies at which the shape memory alloy, the artificial muscle, is being stimulated. And then the only other parameters are whether they're on or off, so you can selectively say do it or don't, what the phase is, the phase relationship between those different groups, and whether or not they're positive or negative. So this sort of mimics the way we think the simple control system in Manduka works, and we'll try and, we've built this already, and now we're trying to make it work. Just to give a quick example, and then we can go to some questions, but this is our work loop for a shape memory alloy. So again, you've got force here against length. What's this? Yeah, relative force against length. And obviously these are a little stiffer materials and a little more rigid. They transition much more quickly, but it's going around this work loop here. If we stimulate at 60% duty cycle at 1.6 hertz, we get this work loop. If we go a higher frequency and a lower duty cycle, we get this work loop. So we can switch these guys between the states, which is the point I was trying to make about the muscle. You can move into multiple states depending on the stimulation conditions. It's not exact model of the muscle, but even in this crude level, we clearly got the complexity for the control system. got to make sure that you see the people that do the work, because this is a lot of people involved. These guys here are both graduate students who are working on the project. Mike is doing sensory system that I didn't talk about. Linnea is an animal behaviorist. Woody's doing all of the muscle work. He's a postdoc in the lab. And these guys are undergraduates that were involved in a lot of the work, and Dan Rogers here was the guy that started building the robot for us. And YT is a physics major that got his degree in physics and is now a biologist, and he's building a lot of the electronic stuff for us as well, collectively with the soft-bodied robots team. But what I'll do is I'll stop now, because I think it's important to pursue some of the ideas that might have come up in the soft-bodied robot plan.
So how far along are your little mechanical models?
We have robotic caterpillars that are just shells of elastomer, and inside are bonded the shape memory alloy springs, and they will wiggle and move, but we haven't yet got to any sort of, it's not reliable enough for manufacturing process for us to start optimizing. The trick, and I didn't really show it, is the process. Go back a little bit. What you can't, unlike traditional robotics, it would be a big mistake to make one prototype and then refine it. We need to make lots, dozens. We need to have a process by which these can be generated quickly, cheaply, so we can change structure, we can change material properties very, very easily. So there won't be one prototype. So far what we've got is this system here. We've got, we can use subtractive prototyping. It's not the best, but basically milling things out. We have a rapid prototyping machine to make molds, and those molds then we cast the material in. The trick is getting the shape memory alloy springs attached in the molding process. And
the 3D printer are you using?
this one's the Dimension STL. The resolution's a little lower, but it makes ABS.
And then how do you make the molds from the plastic?
How do we? Oh, we use the positive is actually that's a very good. You clearly done rapid prototyping, so I know your work. So the positive is actually made of multiple components that unlock, so you can take them out. But we're having trouble making that work properly. So what we've decided to do, and you guys are inventive. Somebody come up with a good way to do this. We're making our positives now out of wax, and embedding the shape memory springs in the wax as we cast it. We put that into the mold, cast the rubber around it, take it out, melt the wax away, and all the springs are left in place, in theory. Yes?
So to say, you're building these, and each time you build them, they contain a certain amount of inherent variation, slight variations in the construction structure. There's been a lot of work done. I know John was working on some of this, Jordan, lots of people, on basically having genetic algorithms that learn to walk or learn to locomote given a certain structure. And first of all, I wonder if you could do that with this. Basically, given each unique mold, actual item that you make, you could make a brain that actually learned how to make that particular physical item walk. Secondly, I wonder if that's not biologically authentic, because I think that all living organisms, to a certain extent, when they come into existence, must learn, oh, what am I? How do I make myself work?
Yeah.
I've got one leg shorter than the other, and I can still get around town.
Yeah. So I wonder if not only is that possible, but is that not biologically authentic?
Yeah, I would agree. It means that the design has to be both tolerant of those sorts of differences and robust to changes as well, because shape memory, anyone who's used shape memory alloy knows that it doesn't stay constant over cycles. And so I think that actually it drives the engineers crazy, and understandably, because the lack of predictability but I think that we need to build that into our design to make these things work. I think that's more biomimetic. We all have to, you strain a muscle, you still get around okay. We have to build that into our designs, the robust nature.
What would happen if you took one of these caterpillars and you started elongating just a couple of the muscles, you know, what kind of changes would happen in its behavior to compensate for that? I mean, have you tried anything like that?
It's a great question, and it's one reason we have to build the robot, because some of these experiments can't be done on the animal. You can do some of them. You can, for example, damage a muscle or damage a set of nerves to a muscle. And we've done some of that. The remarkable thing is they compensate, as you'd expect. So one thing we did was to cut the nerve cord. So here's a caterpillar that's been scanned. Here's the head end, here's the back end. We cut the nerve cord right there, or right there, or right there. So that the back end is no longer communicating with the front end. There is no way in which they can initiate a sequence of behavior from the brain to make the back end work. And what they do, the back end's paralyzed as far as spontaneous walking is concerned, although it can respond to sensory touch and reflexes. And it just drags the back end along and gets around just fine, by and large. I mean, there's going to be some limits. The caterpillar you saw, if it's holding all its back legs, it can cantilever out over 90% of its body length, no problem whatsoever. As soon as you cut the nerve cord in the back end, obviously that has to go as well. But yeah, it's a great idea.
So these memory alloy muscles, they're not really attached to anything formally, right? In other words, the fluid goes around and molds in. The coil against the rubber kind of provides traction, right? Because as an engineer, you think, oh, it's a coil that shrinks and contracts, so it's attached to the gear.
It's attached to the both ends.
But it isn't really, because there's no, it's just rubber. What's around them is rubber. There's no other exoskeleton.
No.
So it's just completely embedded in the rubber.
No, it's not actually embedded in it. That's the problem. If it was embedded, it would be easy to make. The trick is it can't be embedded because the spring will not adequately contract it when it's bound.
It's hollow in the middle.
Yes.
And then the ends.
The ends are attached.
Oh, so there's little.
Which mimics the muscle in the end.
There's a little T-joint. There's enough for it to grab it in the rubber, and then it's kind of squeeze it over.
That's the way we're doing it.
Because if the rubber were very conforming, you could put it all around it, and it would, almost like Jello.
Yeah.
Jello would be so, wimpy in its resistance.
Yeah. You still got to have the ends anchored though.
Yeah, I get it. So there's a lot of old work on electroactive polymers. There's a couple of companies, what are called nanomuscle. They're trying to use the ENTs to make vectors, things like face puppets in Hollywood. And very small things. I was struck earlier. You talked by the rubber with carbon black model and the muscle that you've isolated from the caterpillar, and I'm wondering what kind of, what could we do to shorten the time to get something like that into prototype use? Because, even if you needed, say, a whole room full of equipment to do the simulation of that rubber, if it had a better strength profile and a more natural motor speed profile, muscle speed profile than other artificial, elastomeric motors.
Yeah.
It would, then essentially using that to build your critters would give you something fundamentally new that you could leverage.
Yeah, absolutely.
Whereas building something with the nitinol wires takes us all the way back to a guy in Indiana, 1992 or something.
Yeah. I absolutely agree, but the difficulty right now is the electroactive polymers have been around for just almost as long.
Right, and no one's gotten them. They're like cellular automata. No one's used for anything.
No, they've been unfortunately a big disappointment in terms of application. There are actually some products out there now, which are, for example, focused lenses, which are run off electroactive polymers, very small lenses. So there are some uses of them, but they've got big problems. I mean, many of them take an enormous voltage, which is a big problem. The ones that don't take an enormous voltage tend to be very, very hydrated and difficult to integrate with anything else, with electronics. They're wet. They're wet. They're chemically unstable. So to answer your question about where to go with that, it's a little bit longer term. What we wanted was to have in the immediate future, we'd like to be able to get going on making control systems that integrate materials. And we use what's around right now. The longer term aim, and I didn't talk about it at all because mainly one of my collaborators, Dave Kaplan, is a tissue engineer, is to build functionalized biopolymers. And what he's out of silk and resin. Now resin is the most efficient rubber known to mankind. It's found in insect wings and wing joints. 99% efficient rubber. This is like the movie film. You drop it, you can throw it out. It's an astounding rubber material. And he has made it a recombinant version of that, so he can actually generate that stuff. And silk. Silk is actually tougher than Kevlar, way tougher than steel. And silk is a protein, and it can be generated recombinantly and can be formed into membranes, strips, all sorts of things. And he has a method of adding amino acids that are charged that allows these polymers to conduct in specific ways and to move. And we would like to start to integrate those because this technology should just be adaptable to any material if we get it to work. But that's a much longer term goal. Your point's very well taken.
You want to make the memory shaped metal work more like your real muscle. Couldn't you just build a little filtering system in between so that, right? I mean, you know, whatever that is, a bipod or something, but ultimately you give it this signal or some little magical mathematical box, and then what comes out is a motion that matches. It would make your control problem. At least it would end up looking more like the caterpillar solution.
That's interesting. Would it be cheating though?
Well, it's not cheating because what you're doing is saying, well, we don't have a muscle, we really want a muscle, so I'm going to build a little filter that's going to make my shape metal behave like a muscle, and whatever control. I mean, I don't know whether you want to bother with that or not.
No, I like that very much because it gives us another avenue. Instead of trying to struggle with not being material experts to get the right material properties.
Just build a little black box with a bunch of filters and non-filters to go.
But do estimates have an analog response like that though? From your image, it looked like they were pretty binary. You give it enough voltage and boom, it goes.
Well, when they're frequency modulated driving is actually very helpful because they do have a transition temperature which is somewhat on or off. So the transition between crystalline states, the transition temperature is fairly strict.
Okay.
But what you can do, of course, by frequency modulating, you sort of jump back and forth over that threshold, so you can get sub-maximal contractions. And so you can get a tune out of it.
So the dynamics of your muscles are considerably different than the dynamics of the moth muscle. Do you suspect that you're going to find that there's something magical about the moth muscle? Or do you think that you'll just go off and play and figure out, for whatever kind of muscle it is, here's how I control it?
I don't think there's anything particularly magical about these muscles. I think the question is still on the table whether individual muscles are functionally different from one another. We're exploring that. I suspect they're all pretty much similar, and it's the way they're used that it's critical. Is this muscle so different that we won't be able to apply this technology to a vertebrate? I don't think so. It turns out that if you look carefully at vertebrate muscles, that you actually see very many of these same properties. It's just that they haven't been concentrated on them because people didn't think they were that important, I guess. You know, when you've got a big bone attached, you're not so interested in what the passive property of this might be. But it turns out that a lot of those things are in there. There's a big protein called titin. It's one of the biggest proteins known to humans. And it's about a third of all the protein in muscles. And nobody knew what it did because they'd never really figured it out. And it turns out it's responsible for the passive properties. It's an elastomer. And it's got multiple spring rates. So as you stretch it out, you get different forces and that's in muscle. So that's in our own muscle. And it's in this head.
So another question. I have a friend who has been working on things you wear to augment your physical properties. And one of the things that was interesting was that you can recapture certain kind of muscles. You can recapture energy as you do that. I guess that would be most important in big systems where there's a lot of energy. But have you thought much about this is kind of like hybrid technology?
kangaroos are a great example of recapturing energy. I don't know if you know
It's elastic.
It's elastic recoil.
Right, it's not muscle.
But it's the muscle-tendon combination. So what you have in the vertebrates are tendons, ligaments, and muscles working with the bones. And a kangaroo can actually carry, a joey, a fairly large young juvenile in its pouch, with zero extra cost, energy cost, when it's jumping, which defies physics, right? It's carrying more stuff. It has to be doing more work, but it turns out it's actually more efficient at recovering energy when it has the joey than when it doesn't. So it works out to be a wash. So elastic recoil is big, but these animals, see how slow they are? I think that there's very, very little kinetic energy transferred into potential energy, etc. So yeah, I skipped over that to talk, but I don't think there's much exchange in this.
So what do you actually need the GA for, or the GP? Because you're kind of close, right? You said that you've got some stuff twitching and kind of being creepy. So what do you need the GA just to make it more efficient, or to make it more adaptable to kind of having its spine cut, or?
Okay, so the first approach to take is that we just have a finite state machine of some sort that we're designed to make it wiggle. Okay, so it'll contract here. But we actually don't know what the appropriate sequence of contractions and the timing of contractions and all those types of things are to make it do that well. And we certainly don't know what you'll need to do when it changes terrain or direction or orientation. So what we'd like to do is employ the GA techniques to try and find out those sorts of things.
Are there any impediments to that? I mean, you're presumably familiar with those.
The impediment is I have nobody who
but it's not like you've read the textbooks, tried it out, and because my instincts are great, what they need were great. But it would be efficiency of the system. So it strikes me that you would do it all in simulation initially. Because you can do it, 1,000 times faster than mucking around the real competitive.
So, my reading of what people have done in the past is that you, if necessary, you create an enriched initial population of parameters of genes that you then apply to your robot, because you can't run your robot through 10,000 repetitions. So we would like to have it working in the simulation of those days. The simulation is going to be in multi-stages. The first one is actually not going to be the complete FEA model that I described there. It will actually be a much more abstract version. It will be a three-dimensional, soft-bodied set of masses working together. But we want to quickly move away from that into the continuum mechanics model, because that's going to be a much more powerful.
Get a lot of computing power.
Yeah. We're okay. I think we're okay with that. At least
Suppose it has a network of 1,000 PCs, so it's something equivalent of a great computer. That seems to help them.
Yeah, that's a good question. Whether we probably will need.
Have you thought about what kind of environment? Are you going to write all of the software yourself, or are you looking at existing?
Now I have to defer to my colleagues here, who are the people that actually. So Louis Dorfman, who is the mathematician that's involved in materials calculation. He does most of his work in a suite of packages called Abacus. If you're aware of that, which is I believe it's the state-of-the-art finite element modeling software. It has the advantage that you can define material models and then import them into the model. So although it's not designed for soft materials, it's designed to bring in any model material that you want. So that's where we were going to do it, but I'm open to suggestions about that, because that's not an area of my expertise as well.
So I don't think genetic algorithms more than very much. So others might help you out in this question. But what evaluation function would you have? How would you decide what's good and what isn't?
That's a very good question. We could use any parameters of the animal's kinematics if we wanted. So we know so much about the way the animal moves through the methods that we could pick some criteria from that. My guess is having not thought about it as deeply as I should, that we would first look for translocation, just getting a certain distance. And so
Something maybe like speed or something.
Following on the Golem type approach.
Speed versus energy.
Yeah, and speed's an interesting one. You have to be a bit careful. These animals are not optimized for speed. Obviously, they're extremely slow, and
Sounds like they're optimized for control across the developmental range of the baronet.
yes,
That would be more fun
yes, so they're
than
also
do to evolve the controller for, say, the same machine at 100 different scales. Right? That would
Yeah.
be- 'cause that's certainly one of the constraints on its movement.
absolutely.
Okay.
They also seem to be pretty good at finding their way around your hands when you're turning it over
Right.
and when it's on different surfaces, on your sleeve and on the table. So there's sort of a robustness there, which is,
Oh,
You know.
it's astounding. Actually, I'm glad you brought that up because I didn't mention it. The kinematics that we're concentrating on, these guys are crawling along on the top surface of a horizontal stick. Just because we had to start somewhere. If you now take the stick and you flip it upside down, the animal still crawls just fine. All the forces normal to the stick are in the opposite direction. It seems to use the same motor pattern. How can that be? So then what you do is you take the stick and you go, whoop. So now it's crawling instead of horizontally, it's going this way. The axial forces are all pulling it back down and away from the stick, and you've got torques and all sorts of things. It uses the same basic kinematics. So we were looking at that going, that's impossible, because if I'm walking along, I can't just walk up the wall, even if I had sticky feet. And what we realized is that it's crawling, it's climbing horizontally. It's actually as if you're climbing a ladder, and now you put the ladder horizontally, and you keep climbing the ladder, essentially. So
I think,
it's very robust, but there have to be changes. There have to be changes. The question is, are they in the materials, just forces, and the directions of that, or does it really alter its motor patterns?
well, that might be the fitness function right there, not obviously if it moves quickly across a table, but sort of how robust it is to all sorts of changes.
Yeah, but it really has no sense of what is up. I mean, if you're born without any sense of up, and you had sticky feet, then you crawl the same way no matter where you were.
Do you think so?
Well,
You could. It might work.
It would be a great solution if you could find it.
It depends on having a circuit that can detect orientation relative to gravity. And if you don't got that circuit, I mean, you really
Well,
is
there's probably more work involved, and the question is whether the change in work is negligible.
Yeah, there has to be a non-dimensional coefficient that relates the mass of the body with the weight of the body actually. So the force of the grip of those toes. So we try to pull it off us, and we've got to pull like 10 or 20 times the weight of that thing to pull it off. So gravity is probably not a major concern for these things.
Isn't that correct? Thank you for bringing that up. I agree. And yet, we've actually done ground reaction forces on these guys. We had to make a special device that took a long time. And the remarkable thing is, when it lets go, there is no negative ground reaction force. So if it was Velcro, it's pulling up things. It's not. It's released. It completely releases and lets go before it lifts. So the grip is absolutely critical. Again, didn't go into that, but we've done some research. It's a passive gripping system. So the default state is to be gripping, and it's low energy. Robots are wonderful, but I don't know a robot that can outcompete my dog in the woods. My dog can run through mud, it can climb trees, it can chase through really uneven terrain. Yeah, it can do all these things. Okay? And robots just can't do that because they're designed with a very, very specific set of environmental constraints. They're designed to do particular things very well. If you will, they're optimized for a task. And we know that biology is not optimized for a task. And there's always versatility built in. Now, folks have tried to do a lot of biomimetic robots and done amazing things. I mean, just truly stunning accomplishments. Some of you might have seen this recently. I think it was in Nature. This is actually the development of beyond this, where they made a robotic salamander which can automatically switch between a land and an aquatic movement control simply by increasing the drive to its central pattern generators. And it's work that's done by Alki Isbert and Crespi in the BRG group in Switzerland. But there are lots and lots of models of biomimetic robots. This is a cockroach up here, which some of you might be familiar with. Other approaches are to look at modularity, to use, instead of trying to mimic what animals do, but get the versatility by being modular and be able to reassemble yourself. Lots of other folks have said, well, we do want to pay attention to materials, and so they've been building in compliance into their robots in order to make them work, or they're actually building continuum robots, as they're called. These are built with long rods of flexible material, but they're actually, this one is under-actuated, and it does behave somewhat like a tentacle, but is not really mimicking the living thing. And what I want to do tonight is sort of convince you that there is a way to get to mimic living things that are made of soft materials. This is a little closer to what we're trying to do, but these are very simple. These are soft robots, if you will. This is made out of electroactive polymer. You pass a current across it and it wiggles. This is something from a group in also in Pisa, a collaborating group of mine. They made a soft elastomer and they put SMA, shape memory alloy, in there, and they make this thing wiggle as well. But it's got brass inserts in there in order to anchor everything. So it's not completely soft. What we're trying to do, and an example of what we're trying to do is shown over here, is to figure out a way to make robots completely soft. The materials are so soft you can scrunch it up in your hand and just let it go and it'll walk away and do what it's supposed to do. It's quite a challenge. Why do we want to do that? Well, part of the reason is that I work on a soft-bodied animal. And as a neurobiologist, I was studying its nervous system, trying to figure out how nerve cells talk to one another. And the more I worked on it, the more I realized that it's actually a caterpillar, Manduca sextra, and I am going to bring this guy out, even though you're eating. Oh yeah, I've got a couple here, and I've got some wet nap things to clean your hands if you want afterwards. They're sterile, don't worry. So if anybody does want to handle it, we'll have to do this in here. Yeah. Here you go. Don't tell any of the owners of the place. These are to wipe your hands afterwards if you need to, but they're actually completely clean. You're more likely to cause toxic problems for the caterpillar than for... So while I was studying these guys, I realized that they don't have any articulations, no joints, almost unlimited degrees of freedom. They can twist and turn and move around. If it really is as complicated as most engineers tell me, then these things should have a supercomputer to control their body. Because if you treat that unlimited degrees of freedom as a series of very, very tiny joints all linked in series, and you try and control it that way, you're completely hopeless. You're never going to be able to do it. So the question really is, how do they do it? Because their brain is actually very simple. They don't have a large number of neurons, and each body segment of this guy...
Do you know how many they've got?
Yeah, sort of. The total in this animal is probably around 500,000, maybe a little more. But each body segment has only 700 neurons in each body segment. And each body segment pretty much has enough to control the basic function of the body segment.
Fully distributed brain?
No, not evenly, but yes, fully distributed. So they're segmented. Actually, I might even have something to show you. Oh, I'll show you that. They have a nerve cord, and at each segment boundary, so there's about 10 segments, they have a little collection of neurons, about 700 neurons. And within that, there are only about 70 motor neurons in each one. Okay? So,
there's a coordinated pattern generation that's synchronized to the
that's correct.
cord, basically?
Yes.
And 700 neurons are doing the local.
Yes, that's exactly right. So, that's not a large number of neurons, really. Okay? And so I am trying to propose that the way these guys control their body is not by having massive central computing power. What they do instead is have very smart complex nonlinear materials, muscles, body wall, and just about everything else, actually carrying out the calculations in the periphery. And that's the main message that I'm trying to explore. It may be completely wrong. The reason I'm saying that is that if that's true, and we can mimic it and we can replicate that, then it's a whole different engineering approach to building machines. Because what you do is build complexity in the mechanics to simplify the computation. Counterintuitive proposal.
Yeah, so you're saying the material is not, say, some kind of feedback system within the neurons? Like they're paying attention to what happens, and based on what happens, they do things? Because I thought that was kind of more common. Like you have nerves that would say, this is what's going on, and then you have nerves that say, oh, because that's going on, I'm going to do this. Do you see the
Okay,
difference?
yep, absolutely.
So I'm talking about a purely neuron taking some information in and acting on it, and you seem to be saying, well, the material is actually doing it.
Right. So it's absolutely a combination of both. These guys are highly sensory. Tremendous amount of sensation that these guys have. Large number of neurons. So they need to have sensory feedback to situate themselves. But what I'm arguing is that the motor output, if you take that away, the open loop architecture that's left is actually capable of creating the basic movements and motor planning necessary for this guy to do what it needs to do. That's what I'm trying, that's my hypothesis that we're trying to test. I would, absolutely, got to have sensory feedback. What they clearly can't have is a system where they send information out, say do something, and then pause and wait till they get information back before they do the next thing.
Yeah.
That can't work. It doesn't work that way in our cells particularly well. It certainly can't work if you don't have joints. Because if you think about it, if you've got no joints, okay, at all, how do you know where your body is in space? It's not an easy thing, you know. How do you know the orientation? How do you know the velocities? And you probably don't. You probably don't need all that information if it's done the right way.
Have there been extensive behavioral studies on this feature? The extent of its sensation and its orientation sensors and that kind of thing?
Quite a lot, but most of it's stuff that we've been doing.
So there's not that many Caterpillar labs around?
Yeah, it's actually a very, very popular model system, but mainly for development purposes. We can also take information from Drosophila fruit fly because they have a larval stage as well. So if you add together all of the information that's relevant on soft-bodied insects, there's a lot of research on it. So what I wanted to do, I can go through, I might not get to all four of these, but I'll skip through some of the middle part. I've got four sections here. One is to tell you about this animal, tell you a little bit about the approach, this multi-state idea, that tissues are extremely complex and encode a lot of information. And then we'll talk about the robots, because that's really where people are interested in. You've all got them in your hands, so you don't need to see that. And there's the giant one moving around. I think people in the pub are probably really freaking out.
How giant is giant?
These things get to be about 8 grams. They're highly maneuverable.
How long do they get to be?
The one you see is about as big as they get. But I brought also the hatchlings in here. Look very carefully so you can see them. They're just 3 weeks difference in time between the two stages. The reason I mention it is there is a 10,000-fold change in mass as these guys grow. Same number of neurons, same number of muscles, same basic motion.
So the brain's in place at that tiny stage?
All there.
The whole thing blows up 10,000?
What I'm saying is it's scalable. Yeah. And you try and scale an internal combustion engine down 10,000-fold in mass and make it work the same way. It's just not really possible. So these guys are extraordinarily scalable. And that's something that we're very interested in. You want to get rid of that?
Yeah. Have a scalable distributed system.
Disposable.
These guys are burrowing. That's what you're looking at here as well.
Here's some wetlands going on.
So what we've done is spend a lot of time capturing the motion of these caterpillars in 3 dimensions and just characterizing the motion so that we know how they move around. Just skipped over that for you. But this idea that you can encode information in the tissues partly comes from work that we've done on the muscles of these animals. And the key here is that we can actually identify every single muscle in each body segment. They're highly modular, and I know you guys are going to enjoy that fact. So modules are very important. Each body segment has a collection of muscles in it that is the same. So we're looking here at the animal on its side. Here what we've got is just half of a body segment. It's been cut up at its back, and this is the belly and the nervous system. And these are muscles near its belly, and these are muscles near its back. And so the muscle location is known, and the really important thing is that, bless you, these muscles have extremely complex properties. They're not just one material, they're multi-materials. If you put them into a machine to measure force and length changes, stress and strain, and you cycle them through sinusoidal strain cycles, this is the sort of thing you see. So we're looking at the force here and the length, and we're just going round these cycles. The black lines are actually the muscle before you stimulate it. The red line is the muscle after it's been stimulated. And you can see that it switches from being a relatively flaccid piece of tissue to being a much stiffer piece of tissue. The other interesting thing, you're probably not used to looking at these things called work loops, but we're going around in this direction. So we're stretching it out and then relaxing it. It's actually dissipating work. The sum area of that curve is the amount of work dissipated, lost.
What kind of curve is this called?
It's called a work loop.
A work loop.
Yeah, this amount. So force against length is work. So these muscles, you're used to thinking about muscles doing work, being motors. These muscles are acting as brakes or as shock absorbers. And if you move them faster, the characteristics change.
So you're saying that the muscle is on for the whole duration of going around that red curve?
Mm-hmm.
It's got...
We just stimulated the heck out of it, so it was going tense, and then we ran it through these loops and looked at the forces developed. So the lesson here, not the details, but the lesson here is that depending on the speed at which the muscle's moving, the characteristics, force length characteristics are different. And it gets even more interesting than that. Because I showed some of this to a colleague of mine who's an expert in soft materials. He's actually a civil engineer. And he said, oh look, he says, when you take just carbon black reinforced rubber, you get the same sort of thing, this curve. And we gave him some data and he graphed it the same way. That's our animal's muscle. And we went through and we said, well, you know, if it's behaving the same way, it should show work softening. The first time you stretch it, it takes a lot more force, and then it softens. It's a bit like blowing up a balloon. You know how your kid can't blow it up at first and says, Dad, could you blow this up? And you blow it up, and then they can blow it up the second time because it's been work softened. Well, that's what happens with rubber. Okay, it work softens, and we found that Manduka muscle, this animal's muscle, does the same thing. So it's behaving like a non-linear elastomer.
How does that part of it work? Like the actual animal has to use the bunch of times, or are you saying if you study the muscle separate from the animal?
What it means is that the relationship between the force and the length will depend on how this muscle has been used before. It's got a history.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
And the difference between rubber and muscle is that the rubber needs to be heated up overnight to restore it back to its original state. Muscle is self-restoring. If you leave it 5 or 10 minutes, it goes back to where it was. So there's history dependence to their behavior.
Is that a property of the material or of the behavior, you know?
It's entirely of the material of the muscle here.
So this could almost be without the nerves connected.
What you saw there was all passive, just without stimulating it. Yep. And although I don't need to go into detail, but work softening is dependent on how far you stretch it. So if you just stretch to there, then it work softens. If you stretch it even further, it stiffens up again, and then your work softens at that length. And of course, when you do muscle, otherwise it wouldn't show you it does the same thing. So it's behaving like a material that's a non-linear elastomer. And my colleague is able to model that using continuum mechanics. It's a tremendously powerful approach because it allows him to develop a model that doesn't depend on any assumptions about springs or dampers or anything like that. It's entirely due to the material properties, and we can use it in finite element models and build a, if you will, a virtual caterpillar, which I'll talk to you about in a little bit. So I want to jump forward because what we have to think about is control. How do we control soft materials? The big advantage of the animal that we just saw is that every muscle, each muscle is controlled by one nerve cell. Just one. Now, each of us has a muscle that's controlled by thousands of neurons. So you don't really know whether the things you're seeing are differences between populations of neurons firing or how it's controlled. If we record the electrical activity in a single muscle, we actually know exactly what that neuron is telling the muscle. We don't know what it means, but we know what it's saying.
I'm sorry, you said there were 10 segments, right?
Yes.
There were 700 neurons in each segment, coordinated by something else. And now you're saying is there one muscle per segment with one neuron in it, or is the segment composed of 1,000 muscles?
There are about 70 muscles in each body segment. So 70 of the neurons are motor
directly
neurons.
connected to a single neuron.
Yes.
Which can essentially drive it through its cycle.
Yes. Yep. So what you can do is stick an electrode or a pair of electrodes, bipolar electrodes, into each muscle, record what it's doing while the animal's walking around. And then you know not only the length and position of the animal and the muscles, because you actually know the muscle's position, but you know what the nervous system's telling it. So we've got the two parts. We've got the physical action that's going on, and we've got the